The doors swung open, and I knew right then my son hadn't brought me there to honor me. He brought me to shame me. His eyes gave it away. That night wasn't about celebrating me. It was about putting me on display. The laughter hadn't even started, but I could smell the setup. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. My own son had invited me to a gathering at the finest club in town, and I, foolishly, thought it was a genuine gesture. His smile wasn't joy, it was mockery. One hint was all it took to see the truth. I wasn't a guest, I was the show. His jokes, his arrogance, his stage. In that moment, my chest burned. But with the sting came something else. A silent fire, a cold anger that whispered, "Not tonight. They won't win." He thought he was setting me up for a fall. But what he was really building was his own trap. He had arrogance, but no wisdom. And a son can never truly break the father who once gave him everything. From that moment on, I knew I wouldn't leave that room defeated. Silence became my weapon, and justice began to take its place. My name is Andy Bailey, and today you'll hear how a father everyone expected to see humiliated turned the setup into a stage of justice, with a counterattack so sharp it silenced the room. Before we dive in, I ask you to subscribe to the channel and share in the comments. Have you ever been invited somewhere only to be mocked by someone who should have respected you? But before I reveal what I did and how I turned the game in a matter of seconds, I need to tell you who I was before that night and why my own son believed he could tear me down in front of everyone. The Riverside Country Club sat perched on the hill like a crown jewel of Columbus, Ohio. Its red brick facade and white columns screamed old money, the kind of place where handshakes closed million-dollar deals and memberships were passed down through generations like family heirlooms. As I walked through those heavy oak doors, that October evening, my work boots felt out of place against the polished marble floor. The chandelier above cast shadows that danced across oil paintings of long-dead industrialists, men who'd built their fortunes on the backs of people like me. I'd received the invitation 3 weeks prior. David had called me on a Tuesday evening, just as I was closing up Bailey's auto repair for the day. "Dad," he'd said, his voice carrying that professional tone he'd perfected in law school, "I'd like to invite you to something special. The firm is hosting an appreciation dinner at Riverside, and I want you there." Appreciation dinner. Those words had stuck with me for days. In 45 years of running my little shop on the east side of Columbus, David had never once shown appreciation for what I did. When he was growing up, he'd been embarrassed when his Harvard-bound classmates discovered his father fixed cars for a living. But here he was, at 38 years old, a partner at Morrison, Keller and Associates, finally ready to acknowledge his old man. Or so I thought. The maitre d', a thin man with silver hair and the kind of practiced smile that never reached his eyes, approached me with barely concealed disdain. "Mr. Bailey, I presume." His gaze swept over my navy blue suit, the good one I'd bought for my late wife Margaret's funeral 5 years ago, and lingered disapprovingly on my calloused hands. "That's right," I said, straightening my shoulders. "At 68 I might have been wearing clothes from J.C. Penney instead of Brooks Brothers, but I'd never bowed my head to any man. Mr. David Bailey is expecting you in the Harrison Room. Right this way, sir." As we walked through the corridor lined with photographs of past club presidents, all white men, in expensive suits with the same self-satisfied expressions, I caught glimpses of the main dining room. Crystal wine glasses caught the light. Like diamonds, women in pearls laughed at jokes that probably weren't funny. Men in $1,000 suits discussed quarterly earnings over prime rib that cost more than most people made in a day. This wasn't my world. I fixed transmissions and replaced brake pads. I drank coffee from a thermos, not fine china. But Margaret had always told me that a man's worth wasn't measured by his bank account or his zip code. "Andy Bailey," she'd say, placing her small, Hands on my grease-stained ones. You've got more integrity in your pinky finger than most of those country club types have in their entire bodies. Margaret. God, I missed her wisdom. She would have seen through David's invitation immediately. She would have asked the hard questions I'd been too hopeful to ask. The Harrison room was smaller than I'd expected, but no less intimidating. Dark. Wood paneling reached toward a coffered ceiling, and hunting prints decorated the walls between bookcases, filled with leather-bound volumes that probably hadn't been opened in decades. A massive table dominated the center of the room, set for 12, with china so delicate it looked like it might shatter if you breathed on it wrong. But it was the people gathered around that table that made my chest tighten with recognition. This wasn't a random appreciation dinner. David had assembled an audience. There was Judge Harrison, the man the room was named after, silver-haired and imperious, with the kind of face that had never known a day of real work. Beside him sat Dr. Patricia Whitman, Columbus's most sought-after plastic surgeon, her own face a testament to her craft. Richard Caldwell, the real estate mogul who'd gentrified half the city, was examining his manicured nails with the boredom of a man who'd never worried about paying bills. Their wives clustered together like exotic birds, their designer dresses and jewelry catching the light from the chandelier above. And there, at the head of the table like a king holding court, was my son David. 38 years old, 6'2", with the kind of confident bearing that comes from never having been told no. His dark hair was perfectly styled. His suit probably cost more than I made in a month. And his smile. His smile was the thing that confirmed my growing suspicion. It wasn't warm, it wasn't genuine. It was the smile of a predator who'd successfully lured his prey into a trap. "Dad!" David stood as I entered, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of false warmth. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet my father, Andy Bailey." The way he said it, my father, Andy Bailey, made it sound like he was introducing a zoo animal. There was a calculated pause before he continued. "Dad owns Bailey's Auto Repair over on East Main Street. He's been fixing cars for—" David made a show of thinking, "What is it now, Dad? 45 years." The group murmured polite acknowledgements, but I could see the wheels turning in their heads. Auto Repair. East Main Street. Not their kind of people. Judge Harrison extended a hand. That felt like a dead fish when I shook it. "Mr. Bailey, David's told us so much about you. That's when I knew for certain." The way the judge said it, with that particular emphasis on so much, told me everything I needed to know about the nature of those conversations. David hadn't been bragging about his father. He'd been setting up tonight's entertainment. "Doctor." Whitman tittered behind her wineglass. "How fascinating. I don't think I've ever met an actual mechanic before." "Auto technician," I corrected gently, though I could see in her eyes that the distinction meant nothing to her. "Of course," she said, her smile sharp as a scalpel. "I imagine it must be quite different from David's work." Richard Caldwell leaned back in his chair, studying me like I was a particularly interesting specimen. "East Main Street, you said? I've been looking at properties in that area. Lots of potential for development, once we clear out some of the older establishments." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. These people saw my neighborhood, my livelihood, my entire world as something to be swept aside for progress, and my son had invited me here to watch them discuss it. "Please, Dad, sit down," David said, gesturing to a chair that had clearly been positioned for maximum exposure. It faced the rest of the table, ensuring that everyone would have a clear view of whatever spectacle was about to unfold. As I sat down, my mind raced back to Vietnam, to the survival instincts that had kept me alive in the jungle for 13 months. The first rule of warfare: know your enemy. The second rule: never let them see you sweat. I was outnumbered, outclassed by their standards, and clearly outmaneuvered. But I was Andy Bailey. And I'd survived worse than a room full of overprivileged vultures. The evening was just beginning. As the waiters poured wine that probably cost more per bottle than most families spent on groceries in a week, I found myself drifting back to 1954. I was 18 years old, standing in the recruitment office in downtown Columbus, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a burning need to escape the poverty that had defined my childhood. My father, God rest his soul, had worked at the Buckeye Steel Castings Company until the day it killed him. Black lung disease, they called it. 23 years of breathing in metal dust and industrial fumes for wages that barely kept food on our table in the cramped apartment we shared with my mother and 3 sisters. When he died, I was 16, and the responsibility of keeping our family afloat fell squarely on my shoulders. I'd dropped out of school to work at Kroger, stocking shelves for 50 cents an hour. My mother took in laundry, her hands raw and cracked from the harsh soap and constant washing. My sisters wore dresses made from flour sacks, and we ate beans and cornbread more nights than I care to remember. The army recruiter, Sergeant Murphy, was a thick-set Irishman with kind eyes and a promise that sounded like salvation. "Son," he'd said, looking at my application, "you serve your country for a few years, and when you come back, you'll have the GI Bill waiting for you. Education, job training, a chance to make something of yourself." So I signed my name on that dotted line, thinking I was signing up for a better future. What I got instead was a one-way ticket to the jungles of Vietnam, where boys from places like Columbus went to die for reasons nobody could properly explain. I spent 13 months in that green hell, watching friends disappear into body bags, while politicians back home debated the merits of a war they'd never have to fight. I learned things in those jungles that they don't teach in business school. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what needs to be done, despite the fear. I learned that real leadership means taking care of your people, even when it costs you everything. And I learned that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who smiles while planning your destruction. When I came home in 1972, I wasn't the same scared kid who'd left. The GI Bill helped me get training as an automotive technician, and by 1978, I'd saved enough money to open Bailey's Auto Repair in a rundown building on East Main Street. It wasn't much. 3 bays, a waiting room with folding chairs, and an office that doubled as a storage closet. But it was mine. That's where I met Margaret. She'd brought her 1975 Chevette in with transmission problems on a rainy Thursday in October 1979. The other shops in town had quoted her $800 for a rebuild, money she didn't have as a single mother working as a secretary at the phone company. I took one look at her worried face and knew I couldn't send her away empty-handed. "Tell you what," I'd said, wiping my hands on a shop rag, "let me take a closer look. Maybe we can figure out something that won't break the bank." It turned out to be a simple valve body issue, a 2-hour job with a $20 part. But Margaret insisted on paying me the full diagnostic fee, and when I tried to refuse, she fixed me with those green eyes and said, "Mr. Bailey, charity doesn't feel good when you're on the receiving end. Let me pay you what you're worth." We were married 8 months later, and David was born in 1985. From the moment David took his first breath, I was determined to give him everything I'd never had. I worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week, building the business, so my son would never know the gnawing hunger of poverty or the humiliation of wearing hand-me-downs to school. When David was 5, I bought him his first bicycle, a bright red Schwinn that cost more than I made in a week. When he was 8, I signed him up for Little League, even though the registration fees and equipment costs meant I'd be eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch for the rest of the month. When he showed an interest in books, I turned our garage into a workshop so we could build him floor-to-ceiling bookshelves for his bedroom. Margaret would find me out there on Sunday mornings, measuring and cutting and sanding, still in my church clothes because I was too excited about the project to change. "Andy Bailey," she'd say, bringing me coffee in my favorite mug, "that boy doesn't need perfect bookshelves. He just needs his father." But I wanted to give him perfect bookshelves. I wanted to give him everything. When David was 12, he came home from school one day with tears in his eyes. "Dad," he'd said, his voice small and ashamed, "Tommy Morrison said his dad could buy and sell our whole family. He said we're poor." My heart broke for him in that moment. I knelt down to his level and put my hands on his shoulders. "Son," I said, "we might not have much money, but we have something more important. We have each other, and we have our integrity. Money comes and goes, but character lasts forever." He'd nodded then, seeming to understand. But I could see the shame in his eyes, the embarrassment of being different from his classmates, whose fathers wore suits to work instead of coveralls. That night, I made a decision that would define the next 20 years of my life. I would work harder, save more, sacrifice whatever it took to ensure David never felt that shame again. I took on every job that came through the door, no matter how small or how difficult. I worked on Christmas morning when Mrs. Patterson's car wouldn't start and she needed to get to her daughter's house. I stayed up all night fixing Jim Rodriguez's delivery truck so he wouldn't lose a day's pay. I rebuilt engines for half what the dealership charged, not because I couldn't demand full price, but because I knew what it meant to struggle. Word spread about the honest mechanic on East Main Street who treated his customers like family. The business grew, and with it, my ability to provide for David's future. Private tutoring when his grades slipped in 9th grade. Summer camps that cost more than our monthly mortgage. A college fund that I fed every penny of profit into, even when it meant driving a 15-year-old truck with a broken air conditioner. When David graduated as valedictorian of his high school, "Glass," I cried. When he got accepted to Ohio State with a partial academic scholarship, I cried harder, and when he announced his intention to go to law school, I told him not to worry about the cost. His old man would find a way. Law school. Tuition in the early 2000s was astronomical. I took out a second mortgage on the house. I worked 7 days a week, often until 10 or 11 at night. Margaret worried about my health, about the stress I was putting on our marriage, but I couldn't stop. This was David's chance to have the life I'd never been able to give myself. "You're killing yourself for that boy," Margaret said one night after I'd missed another family dinner to finish a rush job. "I'm building him a future," I replied, too tired to recognize the warning in her voice. David graduated from law school in 2009 and landed a job at Morrison, Keller and Associates, one of Columbus's most prestigious firms. His starting salary was more than I'd ever made in my best year. I was so proud I could have burst. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. The boy who used to help me in the shop on weekends stopped visiting. The son who used to call every Sunday to check on his mother started communicating through brief texts. The young man who used to introduce me as my dad, the best mechanic in Columbus, started avoiding the subject of his family altogether. The first time I truly understood how David saw me was at his law school graduation party. He'd rented out a room at the faculty club, and all his classmates and professors were there celebrating. Margaret and I had driven up from Columbus, dressed in our best clothes, proud as peacocks. I was talking to one of David's professors about how proud I was of my son when I overheard a conversation behind me. "So that's David's father," one of his classmates was saying. "Kind of explains why he's so driven to succeed." "What do you mean?" another voice asked. "Well, look at him. Blue collar, no education, probably never made more than 30 grand a tee. Yeah, David's probably been embarrassed his whole life. No wonder he works so hard. He's trying to escape all that." I turned around to see David standing right there, close enough to hear every word. And instead of defending me, Instead of correcting them, he just smiled and changed the subject. That was the moment I realized my son was ashamed of me. Over the years that followed, the distance between us grew. David made partner at 35, the youngest in the firm's history. He bought a house in Upper Arlington, the kind of neighborhood where I'd never be able to afford so much as a parking space. He married Catherine Whitman, Dr. Patricia Whitman's daughter, in a ceremony that cost more than I'd made in 5 years. I wasn't asked to walk Catherine down the aisle when her father developed sudden business conflicts. I wasn't asked to give a toast at the reception. I was seated at table 12, near the kitchen, with distant relatives nobody knew quite what to do with. Margaret died of cancer 3 years later, and David showed up to the funeral in a $1,000 suit, stayed for exactly as long as politeness required, and left without so much as asking if I needed anything. That was 2019. Since then, our relationship had been reduced to obligatory phone calls on holidays and birthday cards with generic messages printed by Hallmark. So when David called with his invitation to the appreciation dinner, I'd allowed myself to hope. Maybe success had given him perspective. Maybe becoming a partner had made him realize that his old man wasn't something to be ashamed of. Maybe, just maybe, he wanted to bridge the gap that had grown between us. Sitting at that table in the Riverside Country Club, watching him smile his predator's smile, while his wealthy friends sized me up like a curiosity in a museum, I realized how foolish that hope had been. But David had made one crucial mistake. In his planning, he'd assumed that 45 years of fixing cars and 13 months in the Vietnamese jungle had taught me nothing about strategy. He was about to learn how wrong he was. What do you think? Would you have recognized the trap as early as I did, or would you have given your son the benefit of the doubt? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. The first course arrived with the kind of fanfare that suggested we were being served ambrosia instead of what looked like 3 leaves of lettuce arranged artistically around a dollop of something green. The waiter, a young man with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd learned to serve the wealthy without being noticed, placed the plate in front of me with the barely perceptible hesitation of someone handling a live grenade. "Arugula salad with truffle vinaigrette and microgreens," he announced, his voice carrying the reverence typically reserved for religious ceremonies. I looked down at the plate, then up at the expectant faces around the table. In my world, salad meant iceberg lettuce, a few tomato slices, and ranch dressing from a bottle. This looked like something that had been carefully constructed by an artist who'd never experienced actual hunger. "Interesting," I said, picking up the appropriate fork. Thankfully, Margaret had taught me basic table etiquette years ago, though she'd never had occasion to school me on truffle vinaigrette. David leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a director watching his carefully orchestrated play unfold. "Dad's probably wondering where the real food is," he said with a laugh that invited the others to join in. "He's more of a meat and potatoes kind of guy. Aren't you, Dad?" There. It was the first cut, subtle enough to seem like good-natured ribbing, sharp enough to draw blood. The implication was clear. Andy Bailey was too unsophisticated to appreciate fine dining, too simple to understand the nuances of high society. Judge Harrison chuckled, dabbing at his mouth with a napkin that probably cost more than most people spent on lunch. "Nothing wrong with simple tastes, David. Though I must say, once you develop a palate for the finer things," he trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging like a noose. Dr. Patricia Whitman, Catherine's mother and David's mother-in-law, smiled with the kind of surgical precision she was known for. I find it fascinating how different generations can have such different perspectives on quality. What's considered adequate in one era becomes quite quaint in the next. Quaint. The word hit like a slap, delivered with such smooth professionalism that it took a moment for the insult to register. I was quaint. My values, my life, my very existence was a charming relic from a simpler time. I took a bite of the arugula, chewed thoughtfully, and swallowed. Then I looked directly at Dr. Whitman and smiled. You know, Doctor, you're absolutely right about perspectives changing. Take plastic surgery, for instance. Time was, people believed that character lines and wrinkles told the story of a life, well lived. Now, I suppose, the goal is to erase any evidence that you've actually experienced anything at all. The silence that followed was electric. Dr. Whitman's enhanced features froze in an expression that might have been surprise if her face had been capable of that range of motion. Around the table, forks paused halfway to mouths as the assembled elite processed what had just happened. The old mechanic had just landed a counterpunch. David's eyes flashed with something between anger and panic. This wasn't part of his script. His father was supposed to be intimidated, not throwing haymakers. At his mother-in-law, "Dad," he said quickly, forcing a laugh, "Dr. Whitman was just making conversation." "So was I, son. So was I." Richard Caldwell cleared his throat, apparently deciding to redirect the conversation to safer ground. "Mr. Bailey, David tells us you've been in the automotive business for quite some time. Must have seen a lot of changes over the years." It was a set-up question, designed to position me as a relic, discussing the good old days while they smiled condescendingly at the old-timers. Rambling. I could see it in their faces. The polite attention that adults give to children, telling pointless stories. "Oh, absolutely," I said, cutting another piece of arugula. "The biggest change has been in the people, really. Used to be when someone brought their car to my shop. They trusted me to diagnose the problem and fix it right. These days, everybody's an expert because they looked something up on the internet for 5 minutes. A few nods around the table, safe territory, complaining about how the internet had made everyone an instant expert. Course," I continued, "that's not limited to the automotive business. I imagine you see the same thing in real estate, Mr. Caldwell. People thinking they know property values because they checked some website, never mind that you've been in the business for decades." Caldwell nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. These online estimate tools are completely unreliable. Just last week, I had a client who insisted his house was worth $50,000 more than my professional appraisal because some algorithm told him so. Frustrating, I'm sure," I said sympathetically, "especially when you're trying to explain that the algorithm doesn't know about the foundation issues you spotted during your walkthrough, or the fact that the previous owners never pulled permits for that basement renovation, or that the property's been on and off the market 3 times in the past 2 years because of problems the websites don't track." Caldwell's face went pale. I just described, with surgical precision, a property he'd been trying to flip for the past 6 months, a property whose problems he'd been carefully concealing from potential buyers. "How did you—" he started, then caught himself. I took another bite of salad and smiled. "Like I said, Mr. Caldwell, you see a lot of changes when you've been around as long as I have. You learn to pay attention to details." David was staring at me now with something approaching alarm. Somehow, his simple mechanic father had just demonstrated knowledge about Caldwell's business dealings that should have been confidential. Mrs. Harrison, the judge's wife, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents. "Mr. Bailey, do you have any hobbies? Besides work, I mean." Another setup. The implication being that people like me didn't have rich inner lives, didn't appreciate art or culture, or anything beyond the grind of manual labor. "Well," I said, considering the question, "I suppose you could say I collect stories. People tell you interesting things when they're waiting for their car to be fixed. Amazing what you learn about a community when you really listen." Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow. "What sort of stories?" "Oh, all kinds. Take Mrs. Henderson, for instance. Sweet lady, brings her Buick in every 6 months for service. Widow, lives alone, very trusting. She mentioned that someone had been calling her, claiming to be from the bank, asking for her account information. Wanted to help her update her security settings, they said. I paused to take a sip of water, letting the moment build. Of course, I told her that was a scam. Banks don't call asking for account information. I suggested she contact the police, file a report. Turns out there's been a whole ring of these scammers targeting elderly folks in Columbus. Amazing how they get the phone numbers, the personal details, almost like someone was selling them information. Another silence, this one heavier than the last. I just described a very specific type of fraud, one that Judge Harrison's clerk had been arrested for the previous month, though the details hadn't been made public yet. The judge's face had gone ashen. That's quite disturbing, isn't it? I agreed. Makes you wonder about the systems we trust, doesn't it? When the very institutions meant to protect us are sometimes the source of the problem. David's hand was clenched so tightly around his wineglass that his knuckles had gone white. Somehow impossibly, his father seemed to know things he shouldn't know, about people he shouldn't know them about. The truth was simpler than they imagined. When you've been fixing cars in the same neighborhood for 45 years, when you treat your customers like family and listen when they talk, you become a repository of information. People trust mechanics the way they trust bartenders and hairdressers, with the intimate details of their lives. Mrs. Henderson really had told me about the scam calls, but she'd also mentioned that her neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, was going through a messy divorce and was worried about her husband hiding assets. Mrs. Thompson cleaned houses for some of the wealthy families in town, including the Caldwells. She'd seen things, heard conversations, and like most people who work invisibly in rich people's homes, she'd been ignored while overhearing sensitive information. Jim Rodriguez, who owned a food truck, catered events all over Columbus. He'd served Dr. Whitman's office Christmas party and overheard some very interesting conversations about patient billing practices that might not have been entirely ethical. Mike Santos, who delivered auto parts to my shop, also delivered medical supplies to various practices around town. He'd noticed some unusual patterns in the delivery schedules to certain doctors' offices, patterns that might interest the DEA if someone were to mention them. When you've spent a lifetime being invisible to the wealthy and powerful, when you've worked in the shadows of their lives without being noticed, you learn things, you hear things. You see patterns, and when you've spent 13 months in the jungles of Vietnam, learning to read the landscape for threats and opportunities, you never stop collecting intelligence. David thought he'd brought his simple, unsophisticated father to be humiliated in front of his powerful friends. What he'd actually done was bring a man who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. But the evening was just beginning, and I hadn't even started to show them what I was really capable of. Thank you for following along, and I promise you, the best is yet to come. The main course arrived like a production from a Broadway show. 3 waiters moved in perfect synchronization, placing plates before us with the kind of reverence typically reserved for handling priceless artifacts. The centerpiece of my plate was what the waiter announced as pan-seared duck breast with cherry gastrique, accompanied by truffle-infused fingerling potatoes and seasonal vegetables. I stared down at what appeared to be a small piece of meat, artfully arranged with tiny vegetables that looked like they'd been positioned with tweezers. The portion size wouldn't have satisfied a sparrow, let alone a man who'd grown up believing that dinner should fill you up, not serve as a conversation piece. "Beautiful presentation," murmured Catherine, David's wife, speaking for the first time since we'd been seated. She'd inherited her mother's surgical precision in social situations, but where Dr. Whitman wielded her words like scalpels, Catherine preferred the death of 1,000 small cuts. "Dad's probably wondering where the rest of it is," David said, picking up where he'd left off with his systematic demolition. "You know how it is with his generation. They like their portions substantial." The table chuckled appreciatively. Another point scored. The old man was not only unsophisticated in his tastes, but also gluttonous in his expectations. I was being painted as the stereotype of the working-class American male, uncultured, excessive, and completely out of place in refined society. I cut a small piece of the duck and chewed it thoughtfully. It was actually quite good, though I'd never admit that to this crowd. "You know, David," I said after swallowing, "you're right about my generation having different expectations. We were raised to believe that when someone invited you to dinner, they actually fed you." Judge Harrison laughed, but there was something nervous in it. Different times, different customs. Though I must say, portion control has become quite important as we've learned more about nutrition and health. Absolutely, I agreed. Though I've always found it interesting how selective we are about portion control. Take justice, for instance. Some people believe in measured responses, carefully proportioned consequences. Others believe that when someone wrongs you, the response should be substantial. The conversation around the table seemed to slow, as if everyone was trying to decode whether there was a threat hidden in my words. Dr. Whitman set down her fork with clinical precision. "That's quite a philosophical statement, Mr. Bailey. Are you suggesting that revenge should be proportional to the offense?" "Oh, I wouldn't call it revenge, Doctor. I'd call it education. You see, when someone shows you who they really are, you have a choice. You can either pretend you didn't see it, or you can help them understand the consequences of their character." David was watching me with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle that kept changing shape. His careful plan to humiliate his father was becoming something else entirely, and he couldn't figure out how to regain control. "That's very pragmatic of you, Mr. Bailey," said Mrs. Harrison, her voice carrying the kind of condescension that women of her social class had perfected over generations. "Though I imagine your worldview is quite different from ours. Different backgrounds, different education levels. There it was. The knife between the ribs, delivered with a smile. My lack of formal education, my working-class background, my complete inability to understand the sophisticated nuances of their world." I smiled and took another bite of duck. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Harrison. My education was quite different. I learned about literature in foxholes, reading letters from home by flashlight. I studied human nature while watching men face death, seeing who showed courage and who crumbled under pressure. I got my advanced degree in psychology by listening to 45 years' worth of customers tell me their problems while I fix their cars." I paused, letting that sink in. "But you're right about one thing. It was a different kind of education. The kind that teaches you to recognize character or the lack thereof." Richard Caldwell, apparently feeling the need to redirect the conversation, jumped in with forced joviality. "Well, I'm sure we all have interesting stories from our various careers. Mr. Bailey, you must have some amusing anecdotes from the automotive business." Another setup. They wanted me to tell quaint stories about quirky customers or mechanical mishaps, painting myself as a folksy character, providing entertainment for their amusement. "Oh, I do," I said. "Just last month I had a fascinating case. Young lawyer brought in a BMW. Beautiful car, barely 2 years old. Complained about strange noises, worried about expensive repairs." I took a sip of wine, noting how David's face had gone pale. Turned out to be something simple, a loose heat shield rattling against the exhaust. 5-minute fix, no charge. But while I was under the hood, I noticed something interesting. The VIN number on the engine block didn't match the VIN on the dashboard. The silence was deafening. Now, most people wouldn't know to look for something like that. But when you've been in the business as long as I have, you develop an eye for details. A car with mismatched VINs usually means one of two things. Either it's been in a serious accident and rebuilt with parts from another vehicle, or I let the sentence hang in the air like a sword, or it's stolen property that's been given a new identity. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. That's quite serious. I assume you reported it to the authorities. Well, that's where it gets interesting. Your Honor, the young man was very eager to explain. Seems he'd bought the car from a dealer who specialized in previously owned luxury vehicles. Turns out, this particular dealer had a very creative approach to inventory management. I was describing a case that had made local news 6 months earlier. A luxury car dealer who'd been arrested for operating an elaborate stolen vehicle operation. What I wasn't mentioning was that David had been the dealer's attorney, helping him navigate the legal challenges right up until the FBI raid. The young lawyer was naturally very concerned about his reputation if word got out that he'd been driving stolen property, even innocently. Amazing how quickly someone's career prospects can change when they're associated with criminal activity, even peripherally. David's wine glass trembled slightly in his hand. Around the table, the other guests were beginning to sense that this wasn't just another folksy anecdote from the neighborhood mechanic. There were undercurrents here, implications that none of them quite understood, but all of them felt. "What happened to the young man?" Catherine asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Oh, he was fine. Turned out he really was an innocent victim, just a customer who'd been sold a bill of goods by a dishonest dealer. Though I imagine it was quite stressful for a while, wondering if his name would come up in the investigation. Wondering if clients would start asking uncomfortable questions about his judgment. I cut another piece of duck, chewing slowly, while I let that implication settle. Around the table I could see the wheels turning. How much did this simple mechanic actually know? And more importantly, why was he telling this particular story at this particular moment? "I'm sure the authorities were very thorough in their investigation," Judge Harrison said carefully. "Oh, absolutely. They had to be. When you're dealing with organized crime, because that's what it was really, an organized criminal enterprise, you have to follow every thread. Bank records, client lists, attorney communications. Amazing how much information comes to light when the FBI really starts digging." David's face had gone white. He was beginning to understand that his father wasn't just telling random stories. Every anecdote, every seemingly innocent observation was aimed with laser precision at the vulnerabilities of everyone at this table. Mrs. Harrison, oblivious to the chess match being played around her, tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Mr. Bailey, do you ever miss not having had more formal education? Don't you sometimes wonder what you might have accomplished with a college degree?" It was meant to be the killing blow, a reminder that for all his clever stories and unexpected knowledge, Andy Bailey was still just an uneducated mechanic who'd never had the opportunities that real success required. I set down my fork and looked directly at her. "You know, Mrs. Harrison, that's a fascinating question. I do think about education quite a bit. Take your son, for instance." Mrs. Harrison blinked in surprise. "My son? Timothy, isn't it? Recent graduate of Ohio State. I believe he's been having some trouble finding employment since graduation." The color drained from her face. Timothy Harrison was indeed having trouble finding work, but not for the reasons his parents had been telling their social circle. The real reason was that he'd been caught cheating on his senior thesis and quietly expelled, though the family had managed to keep that information from becoming public. How do you know about Timothy?" "Like I said, Mrs. Harrison, people tell you things. Young Timothy actually stopped by my shop a few months ago, needed some work done on his car, couldn't afford to go to the dealership. We got to talking about life, about second chances, about how sometimes a mistake doesn't have to define your entire future." I paused, letting the implications sink in. Smart kid, actually. Just needs someone to give him an opportunity to prove he's learned from his errors. I put him in touch with my parts supplier. They were looking for someone in logistics. Nothing glamorous, but honest work with room for advancement. Mrs. Harrison's mouth opened and closed silently. I had just revealed that I knew her family's most closely guarded secret, and then casually mentioned that I'd helped her son find employment while she'd been lying to her friends about his situation. The point being, I continued, that I've never found formal education to be the most reliable predictor of character. Some of the most intelligent people I know never set foot in a college classroom, and some of the most educated people I've met couldn't find their way out of a paper bag when it came to basic human decency. The table had gone completely silent. Even the waiters seemed to sense the tension, hovering at the edges of the room like vultures waiting for something to die. David finally found his voice. "Dad, I think you're making our guests uncomfortable." "Am I?" I looked around the table with apparent concern. "I certainly don't mean to. I was just sharing some observations from my simple, uneducated perspective. Though I have to say, I'm surprised that discussing honesty and character would make anyone uncomfortable. Unless, of course, they had reason to be uncomfortable with those topics. The gauntlet was thrown. I had just challenged the entire table to explain why talk of character and consequences was making them nervous. Richard Caldwell, his earlier confidence completely evaporated, cleared his throat. "Mr. Bailey, I get the impression that you're trying to make some sort of point. Perhaps you could be more direct." "More direct," I smiled. "Mr. Caldwell, I thought I was being quite direct. But since you asked, let me be clearer. I've spent my entire adult life in this community. I've watched it grow and change. I've seen good people struggle while others prospered through means that weren't always ethical. I've observed how power and wealth can insulate people from the consequences of their actions. And I've learned that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates." The threat was now explicit. I wasn't just some harmless old mechanic sharing folksy stories. I was a man who knew things, who had been watching and listening and remembering for decades. And I was done being polite about it. David's carefully orchestrated humiliation was turning into something else entirely. His guests were no longer laughing at his simple father. They were calculating how much damage this man could do to their carefully constructed lives. But I wasn't finished, not even close. "Now," I said, cutting another piece of duck, "who wants to hear about the time I helped investigate an insurance fraud case? If you still haven't subscribed, this is the moment. Because what's coming next will show you exactly why underestimating someone can be the biggest mistake of your life." The dessert course arrived as the tension in the room reached a boiling point. Chocolate soufflé with gold leaf garnish, because apparently, when you're charging $50 for dinner, you need to make sure the dessert is literally gilded. The waiter placed the delicate creation before me with the reverence of someone handling nitroglycerin, and I couldn't help but think that his instincts weren't far off. David had spent the last 20 minutes trying to regain control of his carefully orchestrated evening, steering the conversation towards safer topics like the weather and the upcoming election. But every attempt at normalcy felt forced, like trying to have a casual conversation while sitting on a landmine. Judge Harrison was the first to crack. "Mr. Bailey," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I feel like there's been some sort of misunderstanding this evening. Perhaps we should address whatever concerns you might have directly." I took a spoonful of the soufflé. It melted on my tongue like sweet clouds, and I had to admit, despite everything, that it was probably the best dessert I'd ever tasted. "Concerns, Your Honor? I don't have any concerns. I'm just enjoying dinner with my son and his distinguished friends." "Come now," Dr. Whitman interjected, her surgical precision finally giving way to irritation. "You've been telling pointed stories all evening. Either you're trying to intimidate us with half-truths and innuendo, or you're genuinely trying to communicate something important. Which is it?" It was a fair question, and it deserved a direct answer. I set down my spoon and looked around the table at these people who had spent the evening treating me like a museum curiosity. "Dr. Whitman, You're absolutely right. I have been trying to communicate something important. Let me be clear about what that is. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. At 68, I wasn't as tall as I used to be, but I still had the bearing of a man who'd never backed down from a fight. For the past 2 hours, I've sat here listening to you people discuss me like I was some sort of exotic animal. You've questioned my intelligence, my education, my sophistication, my worth as a human being. You've done this while eating food and drinking wine in a room that costs more per night than most families make in a month. The silence was absolute. Even the waiters had stopped moving. My son invited me here tonight, and I foolishly believed it was because he wanted to honor me, to bridge the gap that's grown between us over the years. Instead, I discover that I'm the evening's entertainment, the unsophisticated father who could be mocked and belittled for the amusement of his betters. David started to speak, but I held up a hand. But here's what none of you understood. The man you've been patronizing and dismissing has spent 45 years listening to this community's secrets. When you're invisible, when you're just the mechanic, just the working man, people forget you're there. They talk in front of you like you're a piece of furniture. I walked around to David's chair and placed my hand on his shoulder. He flinched as if I'd struck him. So when Mr. Caldwell makes jokes about my lack of sophistication, I remember Mrs. Patterson telling me about the urban renewal project that's going to displace 300 low-income families so he can build luxury condos, and how the city council members who approved the project all received very generous campaign contributions from his development company. Caldwell's face went pale. When Dr. Whitman questions my understanding of quality, I think about Maria Santos, who cleans your office building nights. She mentioned seeing you there at 3 in the morning, performing procedures that weren't on any official schedule. Cash payments, no insurance billing, no record keeping. Makes a person wonder what kind of work requires that level of discretion. Dr. Whitman's enhanced features couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. And Judge Harrison, I continued, turning to face him directly, when you suggest that my generation doesn't understand modern complexities, I remember old Frank Muller, who used to deliver court documents before he retired. Frank told fascinating stories about certain judges who seemed to have remarkably consistent rulings in favor of certain attorneys. Attorneys who happened to be members of the same country club, who played in the same golf foursomes, who invested in the same business ventures. The judge's face had gone ashen. Now I want to be very clear here, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned commanding men in combat. I'm not making accusations. I'm simply sharing observations from my uneducated, unsophisticated perspective. Stories told by working. People who are invisible to you, who you never notice because they don't matter in your world. I walked back to my seat, but remained standing. The beautiful thing about being underestimated is that people reveal themselves to you. They show you exactly who they are because they don't think you're smart enough to understand the implications. They discuss their schemes and their shortcuts and their little corruptions because they assume you lack the intelligence or the connections to do anything about it. David finally found his voice. Dad, what are you doing? I looked at my son, this man I'd sacrificed everything for, who had brought me here to be humiliated in front of people whose respect meant more to him than his father's dignity. I'm giving a speech, son. You told me this was an appreciation dinner. I assumed you meant appreciating family, honoring the sacrifices that made your success possible. But I see now that you meant a different kind of appreciation, the kind where sophisticated people appreciate how much better they are than the simple folk who serve them. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, so I thought I'd share my own appreciation. My appreciation for truth, for justice, for the simple idea that actions have consequences. The envelope hit the table with a sound, like a judge's gavel. Inside that envelope, you'll find some interesting documents, photographs taken by Maria Santos during her late-night cleaning duties at Dr. Whitman's office. Bank records showing the correlation between campaign contributions and zoning approvals in Mr. Caldwell's favor. Recorded conversations between court clerks discussing the judge's unusual ruling patterns. The table erupted in voices, denials, threats, demands to know how I'd obtained such information, but I raised my voice above the chaos. I also have documentation of David's involvement in the luxury car fraud case I mentioned earlier. Seems my son was more deeply involved than the newspapers reported. He didn't just represent the dealer. He helped design the legal structure that made the operation possible. David's face went white. Dad, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, son. I understand that you're ashamed of me. I understand that my love and sacrifice embarrass you. I understand that you brought me here tonight to prove to these people that you've risen above your humble origins. The room was dead silent now. Even the waiters had disappeared, probably sensing that whatever was happening here was beyond their pay grade. But here's what you failed to understand, David. You're not better than me. You're not smarter than me. You just had opportunities I gave you, opportunities I paid for with 16-hour days and 60-hour weeks for 45 years. I picked up the envelope and held it in my hands. This contains enough evidence to destroy every person at this table. Judge Harrison would be removed from the bench and probably face federal charges. Dr. Whitman would lose her license and her practice. Mr. Caldwell would be investigated for corruption and tax evasion. And David would be disbarred and likely face criminal charges as an accessory to organized crime. The silence was profound. 9 people sitting around a table, each calculating the magnitude of their exposure, each wondering if their life was about to end. I could release this information tomorrow. I could send copies to the FBI, the State Attorney General, the Columbus Dispatch, and every other news outlet in Ohio. I could watch your world burn and know that justice had finally been served. I looked around the table at their terrified faces, but I'm not going to do that. The relief was palpable but premature. Instead, I'm going to do something that will be far more devastating to your sense of superiority. I'm going to show you what actual class looks like. And with that, I tore the envelope in half. The sound of paper tearing cut through the silence like a knife through silk. Pieces of the envelope fluttered to the floor, carrying with them the hopes and fears of 9 people who had just been offered salvation they didn't deserve. You see, I said, brushing the paper fragments off my hands, that's the difference between us. You wield power like a weapon, using it to crush anyone who threatens your position. I wield power like a shield, using it to protect people who can't protect themselves. Judge Harrison's voice came out as a whisper. Why? It was the question they were all thinking. Why would I destroy evidence that could have brought them to their knees? Why would I pass up the chance for ultimate revenge against people who had spent the evening treating me like something they'd scraped off their shoes? Because, Your Honor, I'm not interested in becoming what you are. I don't want power for its own sake. I don't need to destroy other people to feel good about myself. And I certainly don't need to humiliate anyone to prove my worth. I walked around the table slowly, like a general reviewing troops after a battle. Mr. Caldwell, your urban renewal project is going to happen anyway. Those families will be displaced, whether I expose your corruption or not. But what if, instead of fighting it, we found a way to make sure they land somewhere better? What if your development company contributed to a relocation fund that ensured every displaced family got better housing than what they're losing? Caldwell stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Dr. Whitman, your late-night procedures will continue regardless of what I do. People with money will always find ways to get cosmetic surgery without insurance complications. But what if some of that cash income went toward providing reconstructive surgery for children who can't afford it? What if your skills were used To heal burn victims and accident survivors instead of just making rich people look younger. Dr. Whitman's mouth opened and closed without sound. Judge Harrison, your influence over court decisions isn't going anywhere. The Old Boys Network has been running this city since before I was born. But what if that influence was used to ensure fair treatment for defendants who can't afford expensive lawyers? What if those backroom conversations focused on justice? Instead of just protecting your friends, I stopped in front of David's chair and knelt down so we were at eye level. And David, my son, my greatest achievement and my deepest disappointment, what if you used your legal skills to help people instead of just enriching yourself? What if you remembered that the law is supposed to protect the weak from the strong, not the other way around? David's eyes were filled with tears. Whether they were tears of shame, relief, or something else entirely, I couldn't tell. I'm not giving you a free pass, I continued, my voice gentle but firm. I'm giving you a choice. You can continue being the people you've always been, selfish, corrupt, using your positions to benefit yourselves at the expense of others. Or you can become something better. I stood up and adjusted my tie, the cheap polyester tie that probably cost less than anyone else's appetizer. The difference is, now you know that someone is watching, someone who understands exactly what you're doing and has the evidence to prove it, someone who could destroy you with a phone call but chooses not to, as long as you remember this. Conversation. Mrs. Harrison, who had been silent since I'd mentioned her son, finally spoke. What do you want from us? I want you to be worthy of the privileges you've been given. I want you to use your power to lift up instead of tear down. I want you to remember that every advantage you have came at someone else's expense, and to act accordingly. I pulled out my wallet and placed a $20 bill on the table. That's for my share of dinner. I know it's not enough to cover the actual cost, but it's what I can afford. The difference between us is that I've always paid my own way, while you've been spending other people's money your entire lives. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. David, I want you to know that despite everything that happened tonight, I'm still proud of you. You're successful, you're intelligent, you've accomplished things I never could. But success without character is just expensive failure. Intelligence without wisdom is just sophisticated stupidity. And accomplishment without compassion is just legalized theft. David's tears were flowing freely now. Dad, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I know you are, son. The question is whether you're sorry you got caught or sorry for who you've become. That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself. I opened the door to the Harrison room and stepped into the corridor. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of shocked voices, the scrape of chairs, the sound of lives being reconsidered in real time. The maitre d' approached with concern. Mr. Bailey, is everything all right? You seem to be leaving rather early. I smiled at him, the first genuine smile I'd managed all evening. Everything's perfect. I just finished giving a speech about the difference between justice and revenge. I think it went over quite well. As I walked through the Riverside Country Club's marble corridors, past the oil paintings of dead industrialists and the crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's cars, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the peace of victory. I could have destroyed them all and felt nothing, but emptiness afterward. Not the peace of revenge. Humiliating them would have made me just another petty tyrant, using power to settle scores. The peace of knowing that I had chosen the harder path. The peace of knowing that when tested, I had remained the man Margaret had fallen in love with, the man who fixed cars and listened to people's problems and tried to leave the world a little better than he'd found it. The peace of knowing that my son might finally understand the difference between being successful and being worth something. Outside, the October night was crisp and clear. Columbus spread out below the hill like a constellation of hopes and dreams and broken promises. Somewhere in that sprawl of lights, Maria Santos was cleaning office buildings and discovering secrets. Mrs. Henderson was probably watching the late news, grateful that someone had warned her about the phone scammers. Timothy Harrison was working an honest job, learning that second chances had to be earned. I climbed into my 15-year-old pickup truck, the one with the broken air conditioner and the paint that was starting to fade. It started on the first try, like it always did, because I'd maintained it properly and treated it with respect. As I drove down the hill toward East Main Street and the little house where Margaret and I had raised our son, I thought about the conversation that was probably still going on in the Harrison room. 9 people trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how they'd been outmaneuvered by someone they'd dismissed as irrelevant. They would talk about it for hours, analyzing every word, every gesture, every implication. Some of them would learn from it. Others would simply become more careful about who they underestimated in the future. But one thing was certain. None of them would ever forget the night they discovered that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one everyone ignores. The night they learned that real power isn't the ability to destroy your enemies. Real power is the wisdom to choose not to. The drive home took me through neighborhoods I'd known for 45 years. Past houses where I'd fixed cars in driveways. Past corner stores where I'd bought coffee during breaks between jobs. Past the elementary school where David had learned to read. The familiar streets felt different somehow, as if the evening had changed not just my relationship with my son, but my entire understanding of my place in this community. My phone buzzed with text messages as I pulled into my driveway. David, probably. Maybe some of the others from the dinner, trying to gauge whether I was serious about not exposing them. I ignored the phone and sat in my truck for a moment, looking at the small house Margaret and I had bought in 1978. It wasn't much by Riverside Country Club standards. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, aluminum siding that needed repainting every few years. But we'd raised a family here. We'd hosted birthday parties and Christmas mornings and graduation celebrations. We'd turned a house into a home through 43 years of marriage, right up until cancer took Margaret and left me rattling around in rooms that felt too big and too quiet. The living room light was on, connected to a timer that made the house look occupied, even when I wasn't there. A security measure, but also a comfort. Coming home to darkness after Margaret died had been one of the hardest adjustments to widowhood. Inside, the house smelled like the aftershave I'd put on 6 hours ago, mixed with the lingering scent of the pot roast I'd made for Sunday dinner. I'd learned to cook out of necessity after Margaret's death, but I still made portions for 2 out of habit, which meant I'd be eating leftovers for the rest of the week. The answering machine on the kitchen counter was blinking with messages, 6 of them, according to the display. I hit play while I loosened my tie. "Dad, it's me. Please call me back. We need to talk about tonight. Please call me." David's voice, shaky and desperate. The message had been left 47 minutes ago, probably right after I'd left the club. "Mr. Bailey, this is Richard Caldwell. I think there may have been some misunderstandings this evening. Perhaps we could meet for coffee and discuss how we might collaborate on some community improvement projects." Caldwell, trying to negotiate. Trying to turn my moral ultimatum into a business proposition. "Andy, this is Patricia Whitman. I've been thinking about what you said tonight. I'd like to discuss some pro bono work that might benefit the community. Please call me at your earliest convenience." Dr. Whitman, already calculating how to protect herself by appearing to embrace the path I'd suggested. The next 3 messages were variations on the same theme. Judge Harrison's wife calling to discuss charitable opportunities. David calling again with increasing desperation, and Caldwell again, this time offering to fund the entire relocation project for displaced families if we could just sit down and hash out the details. I deleted all the messages without responding. They were missing the point entirely. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a business deal where they could buy their way out of moral consequences. It was a wake-up call, and either they would learn from it or they wouldn't. I poured myself a glass of the cheap whiskey I kept for special occasions and settled into my recliner, the same chair where I'd sat every evening for 20 years, reading the paper while Margaret watched her shows. The silence of the house wrapped around me like a familiar blanket, but tonight it felt different. Peaceful instead of lonely. My phone rang at 10:30, David's number. "Hello, son." "Dad, please don't hang up. I need to explain." "There's nothing to explain, David. You made your position clear tonight." "No, I didn't. I mean, yes, I did, but I was wrong. Dad, I was so wrong." I could hear the tears in his voice, the genuine anguish of a man who'd finally seen himself clearly and didn't like what he'd discovered. "David, do you know why I didn't expose everyone tonight?" "Because you're a better man than all of us combined." "No, son, I didn't do it because I'm better. I did it because I remember who raised me." I took a sip of whiskey, letting the burn remind me of all the celebrations Margaret and I had shared over the years. "Your grandfather died when I was 16, lung disease from working in the steel plant. But before he died, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, 'Andy, you're going to have chances to tear people down or build them up. The easy choice is always to tear them down because it makes you feel powerful for a moment. But the hard choice, the choice that actually changes the world, is to build people up even when they don't deserve it.'" David was quiet on the other end of the line. "Tonight, I had the chance to destroy you and everyone else at that table. It would have felt good for about 5 minutes, but then what? Your life would be ruined, my relationship with my son would be over, and nothing positive would have come from it. But Dad, we deserved it. I deserved it. The way I treated you, the way I let them treat you, maybe you did deserve it. But deserving consequences and learning from them are two different things. Punishment teaches people to be more careful. Mercy teaches them to be better." I heard him take a shaky breath. "I don't know how to be better, Dad. I've been living this life for so long. I don't remember who I was before I became this person. That broke my heart, not because I felt sorry for him, but because I recognized the pain in his voice, the realization that success without character was just an expensive form of failure. You start by remembering why you wanted to be a lawyer in the first place. Do you remember telling me when you were 12 that you wanted to help people who couldn't help themselves?" "Yeah, I remember." "That little boy is still in there somewhere, David. You just buried him under ambition and social climbing and the need to prove you were better than your old man." Another long silence. "What happens now, Dad? Now you decide who you want to be, not who you think you need to be to impress other people, but who you actually want to be when you look at yourself in the mirror. Can you forgive me?" The question hung in the air between us like a bridge waiting to be crossed. "David, I forgave you the moment you walked into that room tonight. Love doesn't have conditions, son. It just is. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean going back to the way things were. I understand. Do you? Because here's the thing, David. I'm not going to chase after your respect anymore. I'm not going to try to prove my worth to you or anyone else. I know who I am. I know what I've accomplished. I know what I've contributed to this world and to your life. If you want a relationship with me going forward, you're going to have to earn it. How? By becoming the man I raised you to be, instead of the man you think other people want you to be." I finished my whiskey and set the glass on the table beside Margaret's photograph. "I'm going to bed now, son. It's been a long evening and I've got Mrs. Patterson's Buick to look at first thing in the morning. Her alternator's been acting up and she needs the car to get to her doctor's appointment." "Dad?" "Yes, I love you. I'm sorry it took me so long to remember that loving you means respecting you. I love you too, David. Good night." I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet house for a few more minutes, thinking about choices and consequences, about the difference between winning and being right, about the strange power that comes from refusing to use the power you have. Outside, Columbus settled into its nighttime rhythm. Police officers and night shift workers and insomniacs navigating the darkness, each carrying their own burdens and hopes and regrets. Somewhere in Upper Arlington, 9 people were having the most important conversations of their lives, trying to figure out how to become worthy of a mercy they'd never expected to receive. And here on East Main Street, in a small house that had seen a lifetime of love and loss and simple human persistence, an old mechanic was finally at peace with the choices he'd made. Tomorrow, Mrs. Patterson would get her alternator fixed. Timothy Harrison would go to his honest job and continue learning about second chances. David would begin the long process of figuring out who he really wanted to be, and I would continue being what I'd always been. Not the smartest man in the room, not the richest, not the most powerful, but something more important. A man who'd learned the difference between justice and revenge and chosen the harder path. 3 weeks later, I was under the hood of Mrs. Patterson's Buick when I heard the familiar sound of expensive shoes on concrete. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. Only one person in my neighborhood wore Italian leather to visit an auto repair shop. "Morning, Dad!" David's voice carried a hesitancy I hadn't heard since he was a child, asking if he was in trouble. I finished tightening the alternator belt before emerging from under the hood, wiping my hands on a shop rag that had seen better decades. He stood in the doorway of my shop like he was entering a foreign country, his $1,000 suit incongruous, among the tool chests and tire racks. But something was different about him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that might have been humility. "David," I nodded toward the coffee pot in the corner. "Pour yourself a cup if you want. It's not Riverside Country Club quality, but it'll wake you up." He poured coffee into a chipped mug with "World's Greatest Dad" printed on the side, a Father's Day gift from when he was 8 years old. I'd kept it all these years, though I couldn't remember the last time anyone besides me had drunk from it. "How's Mrs. Patterson's car?" Alternator was shot, just like she thought. 3rd one in 5 years, but she drives it hard and puts a lot of miles on it getting to her volunteer work. Volunteer work? Meals on Wheels, mostly. Delivers food to shut-ins 3 days a week. Woman 73 years old and puts in more community service hours than most people half her age. David nodded, processing this information as if it meant something more than small talk about a customer's car. "Dad, I need to tell you something." I leaned against the workbench and waited. Over the past 3 weeks, David had called twice, short conversations where he'd tried to explain his behavior, and I'd listened without judgment. But this was the first time he'd shown up in person. "I resigned from Morrison Keller and Associates." That got my attention. Resigned. Why? "Because I finally understood what you were trying to tell me that night. I was so focused on climbing the ladder that I forgot to look at where the ladder was leaning." He took a sip of coffee and made a face. I'd been making coffee the same way for 45 years, and it had never failed to get a reaction from people used to fancier things. "What are you going to do?" "I'm opening my own practice, legal aid mostly, workers' compensation, tenant rights, immigration issues. The kind of law that actually helps people instead of just shuffling money between rich folks." I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot of disappointment I'd been carrying for years without realizing it. That's going to be a big adjustment. Those cases don't pay like corporate law. No, they don't. Catherine and I are selling the house in Upper Arlington, moving to something more reasonable. Turns out we can live just fine without granite countertops and a 3-car garage. "How's Catherine handling the change?" David laughed, but there was no bitterness in it. "Better than I expected, actually. She said she was getting tired of trying to keep up with her mother's crowd anyway. Turns out she married me in spite of my job, not because of it." I picked up a wrench and pretended to examine it while I processed this information. My son was dismantling the life he'd spent 15 years building, the life I'd sacrificed everything to make possible. David, you don't have to do this to prove anything to me. I'm not doing it for you, Dad. I'm doing it for me. For the first time in my adult life, I'm doing something because it's right, not because it's profitable or impressive. He set down the coffee mug and looked around the shop. Really looked at it, like he was seeing it for the first time. I used to be embarrassed by this place, by what you did for a living, by the fact that you worked with your hands instead of your brain. But that night at the club, watching you dismantle all those powerful people with nothing but truth and moral courage, I realized I'd spent my whole life trying to become someone I didn't even respect. You respect those people. That's why their approval meant so much to you. I thought I respected them, but respect isn't the same as fear, is it? I was afraid of what they thought of me, afraid of not being good enough for their club. Turns out not being good enough for that club is actually a compliment. Mrs. Patterson's Buick chose that moment to backfire, the sound echoing through the shop like an exclamation point. David jumped, then laughed at his own reaction. Still not used to the sounds of honest work, he said. You will be. Legal aid. Work has its own kind of noise. People crying, people angry, people desperate for someone to listen. Different from corporate law, where the only sound is money changing hands. David walked over to the wall where I kept my certificates, automotive technology training, small business license, a few community service awards I'd never bothered to frame properly. Next to them hung a photo from my army days. Young men, in jungle fatigues, who'd grown old together or died young, depending on luck and circumstances. Dad, can I ask you something? Shoot, that night at the club, did you really have evidence on all those people? I considered the question while I checked the oil level in Mrs. Patterson's engine. David, in 45 years of listening to people talk while I fix their cars, I've learned that everyone has secrets. Most of those secrets aren't criminal, just embarrassing or compromising. The key is knowing which secrets matter and which ones don't. But the specific things you mentioned, Caldwell's campaign contributions, Dr. Whitman's off-the-books procedures, Judge Harrison's ruling patterns, all true, but not necessarily illegal. Caldwell's contributions were a matter of public record if you knew where to look. Dr. Whitman's late-night work could have been emergency procedures or charity cases. The judge's patterns could have been coincidence. David stared at me. So you were bluffing. I was presenting facts and letting guilty consciences fill in the blanks. The most effective weapon against corruption isn't evidence. It's the fear that someone might actually be paying attention. Jesus, Dad. You played them like a violin. I told them the truth. What they heard was up to them. He shook his head in amazement. All those years I thought you were just simple, uncomplicated, a good man, but not particularly strategic or clever. Being underestimated is one of the greatest advantages a person can have. People reveal themselves when they think you're not smart enough to understand what they're revealing. A customer pulled into the lot, Jerry Kowalski, with his perpetually problematic Ford F-150. Jerry worked construction, had 6 kids, and stretched every dollar until it screamed. I'd been keeping his truck running for 8 years with a combination of skill, stubbornness, and parts that probably should have been replaced instead of repaired. I should let you get back to work, David said. David? I wiped my hands on the shop rag again, a nervous habit from decades of working with my hands. I want you to know I'm proud of what you're doing. It takes courage to walk away from security and success to do something because it's right. I learned from the best teacher I ever had. Your mother taught you more about character than I ever did. Mom taught me about kindness and compassion, but you taught me about integrity under pressure, about doing the right thing when it costs you something. Jerry Kowalski honked his horn impatiently. Some things never changed. Go take care of Jerry, David said. But Dad, Maybe this weekend you could come over for dinner. Catherine's learning to cook, and we'd like to try out some of those recipes Mom used to make. I'd like that. After David left, I spent the morning with Jerry's truck, replacing a water pump that should have been changed 6 months ago. While I worked, I thought about the strange turns life takes, how sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted clears the way for getting what you actually need. Jerry paid me in cash, like always, counting out 20s and 10s with the careful attention of a man who knew exactly how much money he had at any given moment. Thanks, Andy. You saved my bacon again. Just doing my job, Jerry. Nah, you do more than your job. You keep people, like me, on the road, when the dealership would charge us twice what we make in a month. After Jerry left, I stood in the doorway of my shop and looked out at East Main Street. The neighborhood was changing. Some of the old businesses closing, new ones opening, young families moving into houses that had been abandoned for years. Progress of a sort, though not the kind that made headlines or impressed country club members. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. Dad, I forgot to mention, Judge Harrison called yesterday. He's referring some pro bono cases to my new practice. Said something about wanting to make sure people without resources get proper representation. I smiled and typed back, good, that's what justice looks like. Another message appeared. Also, Dr. Whitman is setting up a program to provide free reconstructive surgery for burn victims. She asked if I knew any attorneys who might help with the legal paperwork. I said I might know someone, and then, Mr. Caldwell is funding a relocation assistance program for families displaced by urban development, full relocation costs plus 3 months' rent. He wants to make it a model for other cities. I put the phone in my pocket and went back to work. There was a Chevy Malibu coming in at 2 o'clock with transmission problems, and Mrs. Henderson needed her oil changed before her trip to visit her grandchildren next week. Simple work. Honest work. The kind that kept the world running while other people made speeches about important things. But sometimes, just sometimes, simple work could change the world too. You just had to know where to apply the leverage. 6 months after the dinner at Riverside Country Club, I was closing up the shop on a Friday evening when an unexpected visitor pulled into my lot. The black sedan was government-issued, I could tell from 50 yards away. Too clean, too generic, the automotive equivalent of a man in a suit who never quite blended into casual settings. 2 people got out. A woman in her 40s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to asking hard questions, and a younger man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They approached my shop with the careful steps of people entering potentially hostile territory. Mr. Bailey? I'm Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. This is Agent Martinez. We were hoping we could ask you a few questions. I set down the wrench I'd been cleaning and gave them my full attention. In Vietnam, I'd learned that when law enforcement wants to talk to you, cooperation is usually the smartest strategy, even when you have nothing to hide. What can I help you with? Agent Chen pulled out a small notebook, the kind investigators use to record conversations that might later become evidence. We're investigating allegations of corruption involving several prominent Columbus citizens. Your name came up as someone who might have relevant information. What kind of information? The kind that might explain why Judge Harrison suddenly started recusing himself from cases involving certain attorneys, or why Dr. Patricia Whitman abruptly shifted her practice to include extensive pro bono work, or why Richard Caldwell's development company recently created a $100 million fund for affordable housing. I leaned against my workbench and studied their faces. Agent Chen was the lead, obviously. She had the confidence and the questions. Agent Martinez was there to observe and intimidate, though he wasn't particularly good at either. Sounds like good news to me, community leaders deciding to be more ethical and socially responsible. It would be good news, Agent Chen agreed. If it had happened gradually over time as a result of personal growth or changing values, but when multiple powerful people suddenly alter their behavior patterns within weeks of each other, it suggests external pressure. What kind of external pressure? The kind that might involve evidence of illegal activity being used to coerce changes in behavior. I nodded thoughtfully. Blackmail, you mean? That's a possibility we're investigating. Agent Martinez spoke for the first time. Mr. Bailey, we know you attended a dinner with these individuals approximately 6 months ago. We also know that their behavioral changes began immediately after that dinner. Can you tell us what happened that evening? I walked over to my coffee pot and poured myself a cup, offering some to the agents. They declined, which told me this was a formal interview, not a casual conversation. My son invited me to dinner at the Riverside Country Club. I went, thinking it was a family occasion. Turned out to be more of a social gathering. Can you be more specific about what occurred during the dinner? Well, let's see. We had salad, duck breast with some kind of cherry sauce, and chocolate soufflé for dessert. The wine was probably expensive, though I'm not much of a judge of that sort of thing. Agent Chen's expression suggested she wasn't interested in the menu. Mr. Bailey, did you at any point during the evening threaten any of the other guests? Threaten them? Agent Chen, I'm a 68-year-old mechanic. What possible threat could I pose to people like Judge Harrison or Dr. Whitman? The threat of exposure, the threat of revealing information that could damage their careers or reputations. I sipped my coffee and considered this. Agent Chen, are you asking me if I had damaging information about these people, or if I threatened to use such information? Both. Well, then I guess the question becomes, what's the difference between having information and threatening to use it? Agent Martinez leaned forward. The difference is extortion, Mr. Bailey. Using threats to coerce specific behavior is a federal crime. Good thing I didn't do that then. Agent Chen flipped through her notebook. Mr. Bailey, we have witnesses who say you made specific references to compromising information about each person at that dinner. Bank records, photographs, recorded conversations. I may have mentioned some things I'd heard around the neighborhood. You know how people talk when they think nobody's listening. And did you use this information to force changes in their behavior? I set down my coffee cup and looked directly at Agent Chen. Let me ask you something. If you knew a judge was making questionable rulings, a doctor was performing procedures that skirted legal boundaries, and a developer was using his connections to push through profitable projects at the expense of low-income families, what would you do? I'd gather evidence and refer the matter to the appropriate authorities. And if you weren't sure, the evidence would hold up in court. If it was more a matter of patterns and coincidences than smoking guns? If the appropriate authorities were part of the same social circle as the people you were investigating? Agent Chen's expression didn't change, but I could see her processing the implications of what I was saying. Mr. Bailey, did you have actual evidence of criminal wrongdoing? I had observations, patterns, stories told by people who work invisibly in this community and see things that important people assume nobody notices. That's not the same as evidence. No, it's not. But sometimes the fear of exposure is more effective than actual exposure. Sometimes guilty consciences do more work than prosecutors ever could. Agent Martinez was taking notes now, trying to capture the nuances of what I was and wasn't saying. So you're admitting you used fear to manipulate their behavior? I'm saying I told some stories about things I'd observed and let people draw their own conclusions. If they chose to interpret those stories as threats, that says more about their guilty consciences than it does about my intentions. Agent Chen closed her notebook. Mr. Bailey, I have to advise you that coercion and extortion are serious charges. If we find evidence that you threatened these individuals... Agent Chen, let me save you some time. You're not going to find evidence of threats because I didn't make any threats. You're not going to find evidence of extortion because I didn't ask for anything. I didn't demand money, favors, or specific actions from anyone. Then how do you explain the sudden changes in their behavior? I smiled and picked up my wrench again, signaling that the conversation was winding down. Maybe they just realized that doing the right thing feels better than doing the profitable thing. Maybe they discovered that using power to help people is more satisfying than using it to help themselves. Maybe they finally understood that respect has to be earned, not bought. Or maybe they were scared of what you might reveal about them. Agent Chen, if fear of consequences is what it takes to make powerful people behave ethically, then maybe the problem isn't with the fear. Maybe the problem is with the system that lets them behave unethically in the first place. The agents exchanged glances, having one of those silent conversations that law enforcement partners develop over time. "Mr. Bailey," Agent Chen said finally, "we may have follow-up questions. I'll be here. Been in the same place for 45 years and I'm not planning to go anywhere." After they left, I finished cleaning my tools and locking up the shop. The sun was setting over Columbus, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of autumn evenings when David was small and the future seemed full of unlimited possibilities. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Dad, dinner Sunday? Catherine wants to try Mom's pot roast recipe." I typed back, "Wouldn't miss it." Another message appeared. "P.S. Judge Harrison called. Said to tell you that pro bono cases are up 300% this year, and the quality of representation has never been better. And then, also, the Henderson case settled for full damages. Mrs. Henderson says to thank you for the referral." I smiled and walked to my truck. The FBI investigation would probably continue for a few more weeks, but they wouldn't find evidence of crimes that had never been committed. What they would find, if they looked carefully enough, was something much more interesting. Proof that sometimes the most effective way to fight corruption isn't with laws and regulations, but with truth and consequences delivered by someone nobody saw coming. Sometimes justice looks like revenge, but feels like mercy. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone ignores. And sometimes a simple mechanic from East Main Street can change the world just by reminding powerful people that someone is always watching, someone is always listening, and someone always remembers. The drive home took me past the construction site where Caldwell's affordable housing project was beginning to take shape, past the community clinic where Dr. Whitman now volunteered 3 days a week, past the courthouse where Judge Harrison was earning back the respect he'd nearly lost. Change was happening, not because I'd forced it, but because I'd given people a choice: become worthy of their privileges or lose them. Most people, when given that choice clearly enough, will surprise you, even people who seemed beyond redemption, even my son. 2 years have passed since that October evening at the Riverside Country Club, and as I sit here in my shop on this quiet Saturday morning, I find myself reflecting on how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. Mrs. Patterson's Buick is still giving her trouble, alternators mostly, though last month it was the transmission. She's 85 now and probably shouldn't be driving, but her volunteer work keeps her going, and I keep her car running because some things are more important than safety regulations. The neighborhood has continued to evolve. The old Murphy's, Five and Dime, is now a coffee shop run by a young couple from Portland who make excellent coffee and treat their customers like family. The abandoned lot across the street has been turned into a community garden where families grow vegetables and children learn that food doesn't just appear in grocery stores. David's legal aid practice has grown beyond anything he imagined when he started it. He's hired 3 other attorneys and a paralegal, and they're handling cases across central Ohio. Last month, he won a workers' compensation case that set a precedent for injured employees throughout the state. He calls me every Sunday, and we have dinner at his house twice a month. Catherine has become an excellent cook, and she's pregnant with their first child, my first grandchild. They've asked me to be in the delivery room when the baby comes. I told them I'd be honored. Judge Harrison retired last year and now volunteers with a legal clinic that provides free services to immigrants and refugees. He sent me a Christmas card with a note that said simply, "Thank you for reminding me why I became a judge in the first place." Dr. Whitman's pro bono reconstructive surgery program has become a model for other cities. She's performed over 200 free procedures for children with cleft palates, burn victims and accident survivors. The program has its own foundation, now funded by donations from grateful patients and guilt-ridden wealthy donors. Richard Caldwell's Affordable Housing Fund has built over 300 units of quality housing for working families. He's also established a job training program that teaches construction skills to unemployed young adults. Last month, he hired 2 of my former customers as project managers. The FBI investigation concluded after 6 months with no charges filed against anyone. Agent Chen stopped by the shop one final time to tell me they'd found no evidence of extortion or coercion. She also mentioned, with what might have been a smile, that they had found evidence of the most successful community improvement initiative in Columbus history. "Whatever you said to those people that night," she told me, "you should consider writing a book about it." I told her I was better with wrenches than words, but perhaps she was right. Perhaps there's value in sharing what I've learned about the difference between justice and revenge, about the power of truth spoken at the right moment, about the strange alchemy that transforms shame into wisdom when mixed with just the right amount of mercy. The truth is, I didn't set out to change anyone's life that night. I went to dinner with my son, hoping to reconnect with the boy I'd raised and sacrificed everything for. When I realized I'd been brought there to be humiliated, I had a choice. I could accept the humiliation and let them have their fun. I could retaliate with the weapons they'd given me, or I could do something they never expected. I could show them what real strength looks like. Real strength isn't the ability to destroy your enemies. Anyone with sufficient power or information can do that. Real strength is the wisdom to choose not to use the weapons you have, even when you have every right to use them. Real strength is loving people enough to let them face the consequences of their choices without destroying them in the process. Real strength is understanding that sometimes the greatest victory is helping your enemies become the people they should have been all along. Margaret used to say that the measure of a man isn't what he does when he's winning, but what he does when he's been knocked down. That night at the country club, I'd been knocked down as low as a father can be knocked down, betrayed by his own son, mocked by people who owed their success to the very system that had kept me invisible. But instead of staying down, instead of hitting back with everything I had, I chose to stand up and show them what dignity looks like when it's not purchased with other people's humiliation. Chose to forgive people who hadn't asked for forgiveness. I chose to protect people who had tried to hurt me. I chose to be the father I'd always wanted to be, even to a son who had forgotten how to be a son. The coffee shop across the street is opening up, and I can see Maria Santos walking to work. She waves through my shop window, and I wave back. Maria still cleans office buildings at night, but now she also works part-time as a translator for David's legal clinic, helping Spanish-speaking clients navigate the legal system. Mrs. Henderson drives by in her 20-year-old Honda, probably heading to her grandson's Little League game. The car's running smoothly. I rebuilt the engine last month, and it's good for another 100,000 miles if she takes care of it. Timothy Harrison stops by every few weeks to thank me for the job reference that started his career in logistics. He's married now with a baby on the way, and he's earned his way back into his parents' good graces through years of honest work and genuine character growth. These are the victories that matter, not the powerful people I could have destroyed, but the ordinary people whose lives became a little better because someone chose mercy over vengeance, hope over cynicism, love over fear. My son learned that success without character is just expensive failure. Judge Harrison learned that justice delayed is justice denied, but justice guided by wisdom is justice that heals rather than just punishes. Dr. Whitman learned that skill without compassion is just technical competence, but skill guided by service becomes something approaching sacred. Richard Caldwell learned that profit without purpose is just greed with better marketing, but business guided by community responsibility becomes a force for positive change. And I learned something too, that 45 years of being underestimated had given me the greatest weapon any person can possess, the element of surprise, combined with moral clarity and the freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose. As I finish my morning coffee and prepare to open the shop for another day of honest work, I think about the baby who will be born in 3 months. David. And Catherine's child, my grandchild. That baby will grow up in a world where their grandfather is respected rather than dismissed, where their father practices law to help people rather than just to help himself, where the powerful people in their community understand that privilege comes with responsibility. Maybe that's the real victory. Not changing the people who wronged me, but ensuring that the next generation inherits a world where doing the right thing isn't considered naive or old-fashioned, but simply the way things are done. The first customer of the day pulls into my lot, Jerry Kowalski's son Michael, driving the same Ford pickup his father used to bring me. Michael's 24 now, married with a toddler, working construction like his dad, but planning to go back to school at night to become an engineer. "Morning, Mr. Bailey. Got a strange noise coming from under the hood." "Let's take a look," I say, grabbing my stethoscope and following him to the truck. This is my life, fixing things that are broken, helping people who need help, listening to stories that matter, and remembering that every small act of kindness, every moment of choosing right over easy, every decision to build up rather than tear down contributes to the kind of world we leave behind. And you? Have you ever been in a situation where you had the power to destroy someone who wronged you? Did you use that power, or did you find a different way? Would you have done what I did that night, or would you have chosen differently? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story spoke to you, if it reminded you that real strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down, please subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Because in the end, we all have the choice between justice and revenge, between wisdom and cleverness, between love and fear. The choice we make defines not just who we are, but who we help others become. Choose wisely.